Hello friends, this video on algebraic expressions part 4 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. So now that we have learned about terms and factors, let us now learn about coefficients. So what are coefficients? So these are numerical factors. Now as I mentioned just now that you will have two types of factors. Some factors would be numbers, which are called numeric factors. Some factors would be algebraic factors. So coefficients are primarily a name given to the numerical factors. So let us take an example. Let us consider this algebraic expression 13 minus y plus 5y square. So this is an expression. Can you tell me what are the terms in this expression? So this expression has three terms: 13 minus y and 5y square. That's because if you write this expression in this fashion, you would see that these are the three parts which are added to form this expression. So that is why these three parts are the three terms that we have. Okay, now when you look at each of these terms, what are the factors? So for this one, the only possible factor is 13 because anyways we ignore 1. If you look at this one, the only possible factor again would be minus y. Now when you look at this term 5y square, how can you write 5y square? It can be written as 5 into y square. So do you think 5 and y square would be the two factors? No, that's not possible. That's because y square can be factorized further. So how can it be factorized? So y square can be very well written as y into y. So this can be written as 5 into y into y. So what are the three factors for 5y square? It would be 5y and y. So these are the possible factors. So now when you look at all the factors of this expression, you see that 13 is a numeric factor. Similarly, when you look at 5 is also a numeric factor. But when you look at the variables like y or minus y, these are algebraic factors. So now when we talk about coefficients, so what exactly are coefficients? Now here in this case, we can say that the coefficient of y. So what is the coefficient of a particular variable? So in this case, if I ask you the coefficient of y, what would be the coefficient of y? So this minus y term can be written as minus 1 into y. Correct? So what is this minus 1? This is nothing but coefficient of y. Similarly, since this can be 5y square can be written as 5 into y, so the coefficient of y square is 5. So you say that 5 is the coefficient of y square. So let us look at some more examples. So I think you understood the idea of coefficient. Coefficient means the numeric factor part. So and coefficient is always with respect to a specific term. For example, the coefficient of y square is different than the coefficient of y in this term. So whenever you talk about coefficient, you talk with respect to a particular term. For example, in this term, the coefficient of y square is 5. Similarly, in this term, the coefficient of y is minus 1. So when you talk about coefficient, you always talk with respect to a particular term. So let me give you examples of some terms. For example, you have 7x square, you have minus 3y cube, you have y, you have minus y. So these are examples of terms. So if I ask you what is the coefficient of x in this term, so in this term what would be the coefficient of x square for this particular term? So the coefficient of x square in this case would be 7 because 7 is the numeric factor for x square. So the coefficient would be 7. Now in this case, if I ask you what would be the coefficient of y cube, so the coefficient of y cube in this case would be minus 3 because minus 3 is the numeric factor for y cube. In this particular case, what would be the coefficient of y? So the coefficient of y would be 1. In this case, the coefficient of y would be minus 1. So the coefficient is always with respect to a particular term. Right? So let us take one more example. So let us say that you have an expression like this. 3x plus 2y. So this is an expression. So if I ask you what is the coefficient of x, so the coefficient of x in this expression will be with respect to this term. So the coefficient of x is 3, and what is the coefficient of y? The coefficient of y in this case would be 2. So this is how we find out coefficients of particular terms. Now, if you talk about coefficients in more general way, because though we often think that coefficients can only be the numeric ones, that is, we always feel that coefficients can only be the numeric factors, but sometimes what happens is we come across some different types of terms. For example, sometimes we come across terms like this, 4xy. So where we have coefficient which also involve variables. For example, when you have a term like this 4xy, so if I ask you what is the coefficient of x in this particular term, similarly if I ask you what is the coefficient of y in this particular term, so what do you think would be the coefficient of x? So 4xy can be written as 4 into x into y. Now a lot of you might say that okay, the coefficient of x in this case would be 4. That's because 4 is the only numeric factor. Now when we talk about coefficient, it is not only about being numeric, it is also about being a factor. But in this case, do you think that the coefficient, that is, if you say that the coefficient of x is 4. So if you multiply 4 with x, do you get 4xy? No, you do not get, right? So that means this is not the coefficient of x. So what is the coefficient of x? The coefficient of x is 4y. Because when you multiply 4y with x, you get 4xy. Similarly, if I ask you the coefficient of y, what would be the coefficient of y? Everything other than y. That is 4x. So in this case, in these two examples, you see that the coefficient involves not only numbers but also variables. So this is like a more general definition of coefficients, because when coefficients were introduced, they were thought to be only numeric in nature. But later it was found that we often come across terms like these which involve multiple variables. In those cases, coefficients also include variables. So let us look at some examples. So let us look at example number 1. Let's say you have a term like this, xy square. So what would be the coefficient of x in this case? So the coefficient of x would be y square. And what would be the coefficient of y square in this case? The coefficient of y square would be x. Similarly, if you look at yet another example where you have minus 7xy square. So in this case, if I ask you what is the coefficient of y square? So the coefficient of y square would be everything other than y square, that is minus 7x. Similarly, if I ask you the coefficient of x, so that would be everything except x, that is minus 7y square. So you see in these examples, coefficients include not only numbers but also alphabets or variables. So this is coefficient. So now, till now what we have learnt is in any algebraic expression you have terms, that is those parts of the expression which are added to form that expression. Every term consists of factors, that is when those factors are multiplied you get that particular term. So those are the factors. Now factors can be numeric, factors can also be algebraic in nature. Now coefficient is a name given to all those factors which are with respect to a particular term. For example, when you take any example, let us quickly take an example. Let's say you have 3x plus 4y. So for this particular expression, you have two terms, 3x and 4y. Now when you look at factors, 3x term has two factors, 3 and x. 4y term has two factors, 4 and y. So all possible factors for this expression are 3x, 4 and y. Perfect. Now when you look at coefficients, so coefficient is always with respect to one particular term. So you cannot say that the coefficient of this expression is 3 or 4. So here you would say that coefficient of x is 3. Similarly, coefficient of y is 4. So that is how you define coefficient. Coefficient is always with respect to the variable of one term. So that is how coefficient is different from factor. So I hope that this concept is clear. So in this case, in this example, when you look at it, you see that 3x, 4 and y, all of these are factors. So there are 4 factors involved in this expression. But when you talk about coefficient, coefficient should always be with respect to a particular variable. That is, coefficient of x is 3, coefficient of y is 4. And you do not have any concept like coefficient of this entire expression. So this is how I think we have very clearly understood terms, factors and coefficients. Thank you. Please visit examfear.com for free quality education. You can learn with a simple 4-step learning process wherein you can watch video lessons, you can ask your questions, you can refer notes and you can take a free online test. We have content for class 6 to 12 on physics, chemistry, mathematics and biology along with practical videos. So please subscribe to our channel for daily updates. Thank you.